All right, you sick fucks. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Uh-huh.
Today we're gonna rip the shiny red coating off the RCMP.
Oh, yeah.
See what kind of nasty shit lies underneath.
Love it.
You know those pricks, right?
Yeah.
Red Surge on a horse looking all noble and shit. Turns out they got a history that'd make a biker gang blush.
Oh, let's just say their PR team deserves a fucking raise for keeping this shit under wraps for so long.
For real. We got sources stacked higher than a moose's ass detailing their fuck-ups, from brutal labor crackdowns to straight-up Cold War spy games.
It's impressive.
And guess what?
What?
It gets even wilder from there. But
Oh, no.
before we dive into this cesspool of corruption, let me introduce our guest.
All right.
Someone who knows this shit like the back of their hand.
Happy to be here. Ready to spill the tea on Canada's finest.
All right, let's start with the early days, before the 1950s. These guys were already knee-deep in bullshit back then.
Oh, yeah. Well, you got to remember, the RCMP weren't always the national police force. They started out as a frontier force dealing with whiskey traders and keeping indigenous folks in line. But things took a hard turn when they merged with the Dominion Police in 1920.
So they went from wrangling drunks to busting unions.
Pretty much. The Red Scare was sweeping through North America.
Right.
And the RCMP became obsessed with crushing any hint of communism or labor movements.
Yeah.
The Winnipeg General Strike in 1919 was a prime example.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine a whole city paralyzed by a general strike.
Right.
The RCMP swooped in guns blazing and shut that shit down hard.
Jesus. Sounds like they were more of a goon squad than a police force.
Tell me about it. Then you got the Estevan riot in 1933.
Okay.
RCMP officers clashed with striking coal miners.
Yeah.
And 3 miners ended up dead. Not exactly a shining moment for Canada's finest.
And they didn't stop there, did they?
Hell no. They pulled the same shit during the Asta-Ottawa Trek in 1935, a protest by unemployed men during the Great Depression.
Right.
Basically, a bunch of desperate dudes hopped on trains and headed to Ottawa to demand jobs from the government. Guess who showed up to greet them? Our buddies in red, who beat the shit out of them and sent them packing.
So basically, anyone who dared to challenge the status quo got a taste of RCMP justice.
You got it. But their bullshit wasn't limited to breaking skulls. They were also busy spying on anyone they considered a commie threat. We're talking surveillance, infiltrating organizations, the whole 9 yards.
Jeez.
They even targeted J.S. Woodsworth,
Who's that?
a member of parliament who was critical of their tactic.
Imagine being spied on by your own government just because you have different political views. Fucked up, right?
Totally. The RCMP was operating with almost zero oversight, and they abused that power to silence dissent and maintain the order they saw fit.
That's fucked.
Yeah.
And let's not forget about their little adventure in the Arctic.
Ah, yeah, the killing of Inuit-owned sled dogs.
Oh, yeah.
This one's a real heartbreaker. You see, the government was relocating Inuit communities, and numerous Inuit accounts allege that the RCMP was involved in the mass killing of sled dogs. These dogs were essential for transportation and survival in the harsh Arctic environment.
Right.
Imagine the devastation, the betrayal, the pure cruelty of that shit.
It's one thing to break up a strike. It's another to massacre people's dogs. What the fuck were they thinking?
It's a dark chapter, and the RCMP has never officially acknowledged their role in this. But the stories from Inuit communities are consistent and heartbreaking. It's a wound that hasn't healed, and it speaks to the brutal history of colonialism in Canada.
So far, these Mounties are sounding less like heroes and more like a gang of thugs with a badge.
Don't forget the horses.
Oh, yeah.
And the fancy hats.
Right, the horses and the hats. But don't let the image fool you, folks. We're just getting started. Wait till you hear about their Cold War shenanigans.
Oh, boy. All right, so we're moving on to the Cold War.
Oh, yeah.
Where things get even more fucked up.
Yeah, the Cold War, when paranoia and suspicion were thicker than a beaver's tail in January.
You got that right. Everyone was looking for commies under the bed.
Right.
And the RCMP decided to up their game in the bullshit department.
So what kind of shenanigans did they get up to during this time?
Well, let's start with Operation Ham in 1973.
Okay.
The RCMP, convinced that the Parti Québécois was funneling money through Swiss bank accounts,
Right.
decided to break into their headquarters and steal their membership list.
Because that's totally normal police work, right?
Totally. They didn't even try to get a warrant or anything. They just busted in like a goddamn SWAT team,
Right.
grabbed the list, and ran.
Sounds like some real Keystone Cop shit right there.
It gets better. Remember the Richelieu explosives dynamite theft in 1971?
Yeah, vaguely.
Well, it turns out the RCMP stole a bunch of dynamite from a storage facility.
Okay.
Then a year later, they tried to frame the FLQ,
Who's that?
a Quebec separatist group,
Okay.
by planting the dynamite and making it look like they were planning some terrorist shit.
Wait, hold the fucking phone. They stole explosives, then tried to pin it on a political group they didn't like.
Yep. It was a blatant attempt to discredit and undermine the separatist movement.
Wow.
They thought they were being all sneaky and shit, but it blew up in their faces when Solicitor General Francis Fox had to admit to the whole scheme in '77.
What a clusterfuck. Talk about a backfire. These guys were about as subtle as a moose in a china shop.
But the real kicker, turns out these clowns were breaking into places all over the goddamn country.
How many break-ins are we talking?
Over 400. It was a journalist, John Sawatsky, who blew the lid off this whole operation in '76.
Wow.
His expose in the Vancouver Sun revealed that the RCMP had been engaging in illegal break-ins for years, targeting all sorts of groups and individuals.
400 illegal break-ins.
Yeah.
Were they trying to set a world record for police misconduct?
It's almost impressive in a fucked up way.
Jesus.
They even tried to blame one of the break-ins.
Which one?
The one at the Agence de Presse Libre du Québec
Okay.
on right-wing militants.
Always passing the buck, eh?
Never.
Never their fault.
But the truth eventually came out, and it painted a pretty damning picture of the RCMP's tactics during the Cold War.
Right.
They were running their own rogue operations answerable to no one.
It's like they thought they were above the law.
Exactly. They were operating like a secret police force, convinced they were protecting Canada from some imaginary communist threat.
And what was their justification for all this illegal shit?
National security, of course. But let's be real, it was mostly paranoia and a thirst for power.
All right, we've talked about break-ins, dynamite thefts, and spy games. What else did these cowboys get up to?
Well, there's the barn burning incident.
Oh, yeah?
This one's a real classic.
Fill me in.
The RCMP targeting suspected separatists decided to burn down a barn belonging to a suspect's mother because they couldn't get a wiretap warrant.
So they torched a barn because they couldn't get legal authorization to spy on a guy. Talk about an overreaction.
Even within the RCMP, there was outrage over this one. Assistant Commissioner Rod Stamler called it morally wrong and unlawful.
Right.
But that didn't stop the RCMP from doing whatever the fuck they wanted.
It's like they had a license to break the law.
They pretty much did. And it all finally caught up to them in the form of two major inquiries.
Yeah.
The Keeble Inquiry and the MacDonald Commission.
What the hell are those?
Basically, the government finally realized the RCMP was out of control and decided to investigate their shady intelligence operations.
About goddamn time. Did anyone get in trouble?
17 RCMP officers were charged with 44 offenses because of the Keeble Inquiry.
Gee.
But the real outcome was the creation of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in 1984.
Okay.
The idea was to separate intelligence gathering from law enforcement, so hopefully this kind of shit wouldn't happen again.
So they created a whole new spy agency because the RCMP was too busy burning down barns and stealing membership lists.
That's one way to put it. It was a pretty damning indictment of the RCMP's practices and culture during the Cold War.
All right, so the Cold War was a wild ride for the RCMP.
Yeah.
But surely they calmed down once the Berlin Wall fell, right?
Oh, sweet summer child. You think they learned their lesson?
Hmm.
Think again.
Right, so the Cold War's over, the Berlin Wall's crumbling, and the RCMP has got to find some new shit to fuck up right.
You'd think they'd chill the fuck out, but nah, they just doubled down on their bullshit. The 90s and 2000s were a goddamn buffet of RCMP fuck-ups.
So let's dig into this buffet, shall we?
Oh.
What kind of horseshit did they serve up first?
Well, how about a heaping plate of pepper spray and strip searches?
Oh, yeah.
The 1997 APEC Summit in Vancouver was a prime example of the RCMP's crowd control skills.
Right.
You had all these world leaders showing up, including Indonesia's Suharto,
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
a real piece of shit dictator.
For sure.
Protests were inevitable, but the RCMP's response was a complete overreaction.
So they decided to crack some skulls, eh?
They went full-on riot control, pepper spraying, peaceful protesters, strip searching people for no goddamn reason. It was a complete shit show.
Sounds like they were trying to make up for their Cold War shenanigans by being extra brutal in the 90s.
Maybe, but it backfired spectacularly.
How so?
A public inquiry later slammed the RCMP for their lack of professionalism and planning failures. They even hinted that the government might have told the RCMP to go hard on the protesters to avoid embarrassing certain leaders.
So they were basically the government's goon squad beating up anyone who dared to criticize a dictator. Classic.
It was a huge black eye for the RCMP, but it didn't stop him from using excessive force.
Speaking of excessive force, let's talk about Robert Zikarsky. That shit was fucked up.
It was a tragedy. Zikarsky was a Polish immigrant who arrived at Vancouver International Airport in 2007.
Okay.
After a 10-hour delay, he was understandably agitated, but instead of trying to calm the guy down, the RCMP decided to tase the shit out of him.
And they killed him.
Yep. They tased him multiple times while he was already on the ground. The video footage of the incident was horrifying.
Oh, I remember.
And it sparked a massive outcry about police brutality and the use of tasers.
And the RCMP's response.
They lied about it. They claimed Zikarsky was being aggressive, but the video showed otherwise. 2 of the officers were later convicted of perjury for giving false statements about what happened.
Right.
The inquiry ruled Zikarsky's death a homicide.
So they killed an innocent man, then lied about it to cover their asses. Sounds about right.
It's a pattern, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it's not just about excessive force. The RCMP has a long history of systemic racism and discrimination.
You mean like how they treated indigenous people back in the day?
That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
The RCMP has been accused of racial profiling targeting minorities and using excessive force against indigenous communities for decades.
Right.
And let's not forget about their treatment of women.
Yeah, I've heard some stories about that.
It is bad, man.
Yeah.
The RCMP has a long and ugly history of sexual harassment, discrimination, and abuse against women within its ranks. It took years of pressure and lawsuits to force them to even acknowledge the problem.
What the fuck is wrong with these people?
It's a culture of toxic masculinity, entitlement, and a complete disregard for the law. They think they're above the rules and they get away with it because they're the goddamn RCMP.
All right. I'm starting to think that RCMP stands for really corrupt motherfuckers, probably. Anything else you want to add to their list of fuck-ups?
Oh, we've just scratched the surface. There's the Ian Bush case where a 22-year-old guy died in RCMP custody from a gunshot wound to the back of the head.
Okay.
They claimed self-defense, but the evidence was shaky as fuck. Then there was the time an RCMP officer took an intoxicated woman he'd arrested from jail to his home for personal reasons. And who could forget their little gun-grabbing adventure in High River after the 2013 flood where they went door-to-door seizing firearms without warrants.
These guys are like a walk-and-talk-and PR disaster. It's amazing they still have any shred of credibility left.
It is amazing. And just to put the cherry on top of this shit Sunday, in 2020, a report by a former Supreme Court Justice, Michelle Bestarache, concluded that a toxic culture prevails in the RCMP.
Right.
Misogynistic, racist, and homophobic attitudes are rampant.
Wow.
And they tolerate this behavior.
So basically, the RCMP is a dumpster fire of corruption, brutality, and prejudice. Any good news about them?
Well, they do look good on a horse.
Uh-huh.
Seriously, though, it's a mess. This is an organization that's supposed to protect us, but they're too busy protecting themselves and their own shitty culture.
So what now? Do we just throw our hands up and accept that the RCMP is a lost cause?
That's up to Canadians to decide. But one thing's for sure. The RCMP needs a serious overhaul, from top to bottom. Their culture needs to change, they need to be held accountable for their actions, and they need to start treating people with respect.
I'm not holding my breath.
Okay.
But hey, maybe one day they'll surprise us and actually live up to their motto.
Maintain the right.
Or like maintain the bullshit.
Nailed it.
All right, folks. That's it for this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed our little journey into the dark heart of the RCMP.
And remember, if you ever see a Mountie on horseback looking all majestic and shit, don't let the red coat fool Yagi. There's probably a whole lot of bullshit hiding under there.
Until next time, stay informed, stay skeptical, and for the love of God, stay the fuck away from the RCMP.